Hey, ko Bryony Lane toko ingoa. I'm the Program Manager for Engineering Climate Action at Te Aorangaho. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time during your lunch break to join us to listen to Jennifer Wilkins from Helicone present today on degrowth. We've just got another minute for more attendees to hop on, so I'll just we are at 12, but I'll just give a couple more seconds to let some more people join, and then I will kick off. Just seeing if that's going up. Here we go. Okay. Just for those who have hopped on, I've just got a couple of housekeeping things to start us off. On the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. You can submit your questions on here at any time during the presentation. And what we'll do though is we'll collate them at the end, and we'll do a Q&A session at the end around those questions. Questions are open for all attendees to view. So we encourage all of you to use the upvote function on any questions that you might be curious about too. This climate conversation is being recorded and will be shared with you all in the very near future. At the end of this climate conversation, there will be a couple of very short survey questions, and it would be much appreciated if you could take a minute to complete the survey, as we're keen to know that the content we're delivering is improving your knowledge in the climate action space. And we're also keen to hear of any other topics you'd like to see included in the climate conversation series, especially for 2024. And with that, numbers are going up. We are good to go. So what I'd like to do is hand over to our host, Alan Brent, who is the Professor of Sustainable Energy Systems at the School of Engineering and Computer Science at Te Hiranga Waka, to host today's climate conversation. Tēnā koe, Alan.
Great, thank you, Bryony. Pai koto, good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to this webinar. Well, warm in Wellington for a change, so that's pretty good. I think today's topic is really of interest to us, being in an election period. Last year saw the 50th anniversary of a key publication in 1972 titled Autonomous Degrowth, which was commissioned by the Club of Rome back then. Quite dear to me because that modeling was done in the year that I was born, in 1971. And it received quite a lot of criticism, especially from the new classical economists. They revisited it in the early 90s, but basically the message was still the same, right? So we can't continue with the business as usual. Also, around about the early 70s, there are two terms that were coined: green growth and degrowth. And they went on their own separate paths. In sort of in the early 2000s, the United Nations Environment Program really pushed quite hard on the green growth and green economy and so on. You might have recalled. And similarly, there was this body of knowledge around degrowth that also really took on shape. And to this end, I'd really like to welcome Jennifer Wilkins to today's webinar. Jennifer has a math background, but a qualified chartered management accountant and an MBA from Warwick. She, as Bryony said, she's the founder of Helocene, an international advisory and advocacy practice focused on post-growth business transition. So she has quite a lengthy corporate professional background, having worked with accounting, infrastructure, management, and etc., in a range of different sectors, construction and manufacturing, etc. So I'd like to welcome Jennifer to share her thoughts with us today. And yeah, looking forward, as Rodney said, please post your Q&As there, because I look forward to quite a lively discussion going forward. Thank you, Jennifer.
Your koto, Jennifer Wilkins talking. Well, thanks very much, Alan, and thanks, Bryony, and welcome everyone to this conversation today. I'm just going to share my screen right now and kick into this presentation. Okay. I hope you can see that. Alan, is that looking good? Great. Okay, thank you. Well, Houston, we have a problem. When I think about engineering and engineers, I think about problems and problem solvers, and I think about its engineering's groundedness in the laws of physics. And, you know, boy, do we need more of that right now, because the economy that we have is run by economists. And the way that economists think that the world works is not empirical, and it is certainly not grounded in the laws of physics. So the financial economy is a surface phenomenon that sets in motion biophysical changes that impact people inequitably. So capitalist-based production and the infrastructure that underpins it provides well-being and lifestyle choices to those who can afford to consume, but it often ignores those who cannot afford to consume, and it generates environmental injustices for other people elsewhere, both now and in the future. So the financial economy is really a ledger or a set of scales. And on the one side, it uses the dynamics of extraction from nature and pollution into nature and exploitation of people to reduce the cost of inputs. And on the other side, it over-provisions the affluent, pushing more and more unnecessary goods at them through marketing and obsolescence. And this creates a financial differential, which we know as profit. And profit is the surplus that we need to pay back those who lend money into the system as equity and debt. And this is how those who hold financial assets earn their money. It's called rent seeking, because the financial asset does the work. And it's difficult to achieve profits at a firm level, but it's easier to achieve rent on a portfolio of financial assets if the whole economy grows over the long term. So investors keep pumping money into investments right across the system in order to grow it. And that's why we have a growth economy. And it's also why we have an increasing divide between the rich and the poor. It's also why we have an unsafe environmental predicament. But part of pumping money into the system is to pump money into projects and products that solve yesterday's growth problems. And the apex of that, of course, is the idea of trusting in speculative future technologies that will remove past, present, and future greenhouse gas emissions. And this view of the future of growth is underwritten by speculative technology, and it's called eco-modernism or green growth, as Alan mentioned before. So engineering plays a big role in this eco-modernist worldview, because engineered solutions mediate the relationship between financial decision-making and the biophysical flows of materials and energy. So engineering and economics are interdependent. And if we transition to a new economy, the problems that engineers will be asked to solve are going to change, and the metrics of economic success are going to change. So I'll reiterate some of those points I just made as we go through, but we can start by exploring a very famous engineering problem and its solution to sort of elucidate some of the issues and changes that may lie ahead in economic shift. So on April 13th, 1970, there was an accident on board spacecraft Apollo 13. It was bound for the moon. It was about 24 hours away from the moon, and there was a small explosion in one of the oxygen tanks that fed into the hydrogen fuel cells for generating electricity and water. The astronauts felt this explosion. They felt a shudder go through the spacecraft, but they didn't know at first what had happened. And then the spacecraft started losing electrical power. And of course, what happened next is the stuff that movies are made of. And what has made the Apollo 13 movie so successful is its realism about problem solving when the issue is urgent, when resources are limited, and when people's lives are at risk, and not to mention billions of dollars of investment. So it's a movie about problem solving when failure is not an option. And it's a great story, not because it's a success story, because of course Titanic is a great story and it's about failure, but Apollo is a great story because it's a lesson in resourcefulness, preparation, overcoming erroneous beliefs, problem analysis, process, staying calm under pressure, teamwork, understanding human needs and environmental limits and time limits. And so it is an analogy for successfully transitioning from a global polycrisis to a global sustainable economy. So here is humanity's spacecraft, so to speak. And I'm sure most of you know this, but unlike an actual spaceship, Earth is not an isolated system. It has an open energy system because it absorbs and reflects solar energy, but it also has a closed material system until, of course, we start mining Moon and Mars. So Earth obeys the laws of thermodynamics, which are universal, and the first law of thermodynamics states that the energy in the universe cannot be created or destroyed. It just changes form and moves from place to place. And, you know, engineers work with this idea all the time, creating machines and structures that enable the transfer of energy between chemicals, light, heat, and kinetic forms. And you don't need me to tell you that fossil fuels are ancient solar energy, and once we burn them to create light and heat and movement, that converted energy is no longer available to us. So energy flows into the biosphere from the sun, and ultimately all energy is transformed into heat and lost out into space. So global warming is an increase in the heat energy that stays trapped inside Earth's atmosphere due to the greenhouse gas effect of gases such as carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide. And the second law of thermodynamics states that the entropy of a closed system increases with time. So the material fabric of Earth is progressing toward disorder. And so that's why entropy is known as the arrow of time. And humans cannot stop the entropy of planet Earth, but they have hastened it. And here's some evidence that humans have speeded up the entropy of Earth. Everything in these circles beyond green is a state of greater entropy than if humans had not perturbed the planet. And everything that is in red is a perturbation that has become a threat to human safety. And you can see as we go through the decades from 1950 through 60, right through to the year 2020, you can see you're getting not only more red, but more pies that are reaching into red as well. So it's a worsening situation. And now in 2023, the planetary boundaries diagram is looking quite horrific. 6 of 9 planetary boundaries have now been breached, which means they're becoming, these planetary systems are becoming hostile to humans. Now, we cannot reverse the entropy that has occurred, but we can stop adding to it as much and as quickly. And if we do that, these planetary systems might stop changing in the direction they're heading and start changing toward a less hostile future condition. But we must do this slow down before these planetary systems reach tipping points, which would mean they would reach a state of self-reinforcing change that would be very uncertain and probably result in quite abrupt changes in the ecological surroundings. And we know how we got into this predicament. Of course, we burned fossil fuels and we got used to growing the global economy very quickly based on the energy value in a barrel of oil. But how do we get out of it? Well, we need to see the economy as part of this thermodynamic system. And we need to see the economy as driving entropy through biophysical flows, which we need to slow down. So how are we doing so far on that? Because we've known about this for a long time. So first of all, looking at materials, we need to see that even if recycling would improve from currently being around 10% to being, say, 30%, the majority of the economy is still linear and is still contributing to entropy. And in fact, the materials intensity of the economy, the materials used per dollar, is still growing. You can see on the graph on the right that the materials line, the black line, has actually, it's growing faster than the GDP line. And there are no credible projections for decoupling materials from GDP in the foreseeable future. So if GDP grows 3% per year, the whole financial economy will double within 25 years, and all the material flows it relies upon will potentially even more than double. So the only way to reduce degradation of the physical environment is to produce and consume less. And that means degrowth is the only feasible way to abating biodiversity loss, land use change, freshwater change, and many of those other planetary overshoots. And unfortunately, 2/3 of all materials extraction goes to just 10 countries, and their citizens use about 27 tons of material per capita per year, while the poorest people on Earth use just 2 tons. And to achieve sustainability, which means well-being within ecological limits, the global population needs to use on average 6 tons per capita per year. So that's an increase for some people and quite a massive decrease for the affluent. We also need to understand what's happening with greenhouse gas decoupling. It is happening, but it is not happening fast enough. And this graph shows the speed at which a number of high-income nations have been absolutely decoupling their economic growth from their CO2 emissions. So you can see that they have made progress, as all the grey lines, which represent those economies, are generally decreasing over the last 10 years. But then from 2020, you see a rebound. But if we ignore that rebound and we keep projecting the previous rate of decoupling, we can see that rich economies, this is the red line, will be at about 70% of current emissions by 2050. And they would reach net zero in 220 years' time. So by then, those tipping points that we talked about before, to use science terminology, would almost certainly be breached, but I think we know that they would be breached. So again, the evidence points to degrowth as being the only feasible approach for abating climate change. And then finally, we need to understand energy use and the shift to renewable energy. So growth in global energy consumption during the 20th century has been exponential, and that is despite massive gains in energy efficiency. And that's really due to economic growth absorbing any efficiency gains. And a problem with increased use of energy in rich nations is that it has not actually improved well-being exponentially as well. So arguably, a lot of the finite fossil fuel energy that we've used has been wasted on frivolous production and consumption. Now, projections by the International Energy Agency show that energy demand in 2050, this is the red line on the right graph, could be twice as much as it was in 1990. So where would this energy come from? It is not credible that this could be supplied by renewable energy sufficiently enough to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So we must actually use a fraction of the energy we use today by 2050 in order to achieve net zero. So again, degrowth is the only feasible option for achieving net zero. And scenarios that have looked at energy requirements to provide a decent standard of living to all people by 2050, they show that a bottom-up analysis shows that energy consumption could reduce to actually less than 1990 levels. You can see the LED and the DLE lines on the graph on the right. And these also show that using bottom-up analysis, rich nation energy consumption can actually reduce by 95% and still provide for people's well-being energy needs using existing modern technologies. So let's remind ourselves again what these materials and energy flows are for. They are the social metabolism of our economy. They are about providing the things that we need. And we want our economy to operate above an equitable delivery of basic needs, but below planetary boundaries. And this requires a very different dynamic to today's economy, which is all about growing money. So the social metabolism of a growth economy is enabled through a number of parameters, which we're all familiar with. We have efficiency, extraction, accumulation, private ownership, and control of production. And the social metabolism of a post-growth or a degrowth economy is enabled through different parameters, which are sufficiency, regeneration, distribution, enhancing the commons, and looking after people. And so I guess the question for you is, how does this translate to an engineer's everyday job? Well, you need to be asking for every project and every product that you're working on, how does this deliver well-being to people throughout the value chain and not just at the end of it? How does this reduce energy use in rich nations by as much as 95%? How does this reduce materials use in rich nations down to about 6 tons per capita, which is about a 75% reduction in some of the high-use nations? And also, who's involved in delivering this project? Because there are different types of ecological efficiency and well-being deliverability across different providers, including households, the state, the commons, and of course, markets. And so it gets to the heart of degrowth to say that it is not an idea to contract today's economy into the same thing, only smaller. It's an idea for a different economy. So we're going to need different types of technology. And so technologies suitable for a degrowth transition are not designed to build economic growth, but rather to slow things down and to bring well-being. So they are convivial, socio-ecological technologies as opposed to eco-modernist, clean technologies. And I think it goes without saying, I hope to an engineering audience, that convivial technologies go hand in hand with convivial infrastructure. So this image, this type of image is becoming a classic message to show the difference between an eco-modernist or clean technology view of the future and a degrowth or socio-ecological or convivial view of the future. And obviously underlying that electric vehicles future in the middle there is a host of problems, not only the social problems, but problems relating to the extraction of critical minerals and rare earth elements. So, you know, Australia, for instance, has an abundance of minerals within its landscapes, but we do too in New Zealand, except they're in our deep sea landscapes. So a clean tech future will put enormous pressure on New Zealand to license deep sea mining to scrape minerals off our ocean bed. And other convivial technologies include installing composting toilets, creating permaculture gardens in parks and unused car parks and gardens, planting street trees that give us shade but also give us fruits and nuts, and refurbishing old buildings. And sometimes these ideas all come together in, say, an eco-village. But I want to give you something. This is a very busy slide, and it's only to show you that a convivial technology assessment tool actually exists. And there are 5 criteria for convivial technology. There's relatedness, which is between people or between people and nature. So for instance, that composting toilet. Accessibility, which means ensuring people can access the materials and services they need to build and use technology. So for instance, open source design. Adaptability means being able to move technology easily, such as tiny homes. And then bio-interaction is obviously something like the permaculture example. And then appropriateness means that the technology is actually needed and is sufficient. And you can see, you know, this applies across the whole range of engineering projects, from handling materials and wastes through to producing products, using products, and the infrastructure beneath it all. And finally, it would be remiss of me not to mention Susan Kumdrick's book about the new field of transition engineering that she has been developing. And this book goes into the energy decline in a lot more detail and provides a methodology for approaching that. So going back to Apollo 13, the guys at NASA knew what they had to do. They understood the problem. The astronauts' human needs had to be met, and failure was not an option. They understood the limits. They only had a small number of materials and very little energy to play with. And they understood the timeline. It was urgent. So they applied their engineering knowledge and they got the job done. And, all that resourcefulness, the prep, the overcoming erroneous beliefs, the problem analysis, the process, staying calm under pressure, teamwork, understanding human needs, understanding physical limits, and understanding time limits. We need to apply that to our economy today. So it's over to you. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, many thanks, Jennifer. So, yeah, we haven't had any questions posted here. Did anybody want to ask any questions? Please type away in the Q&A. Maybe if I can sort of kick off there, Jennifer, and I said from the start, it's quite a topical topic at the moment, being in an election, because the economists, the politicians always talk about growth, and we want more growth, and this is what people want to hear. So how do we convince our political leaders and even our industrial leaders that there's opportunity with the degrowth?
Opportunity, well, that's a very good word. Actually, I use that word a lot. I mean, I think the professions like engineering, like architecture, like accountancy, etc., they're very good entry points into organizations and feeding in that sort of middle and senior management level up to executive level and the board, feeding those messages up to those people who will be able to put more pressure at political level. So it's really about, finding entry points, finding leverage, and finding those moments of opportunity all the time to talk about this. And the word opportunity is really important because the opportunity to solve climate change, the opportunity to bring well-being, the opportunity to reduce biodiversity loss, these are greater opportunities than the opportunity to give profit to people who are already wealthy.
A question here from Matthew is, how can we motivate traditional investors to invest in this sort of growth? The current ideology we have is so ingrained that it seems as if it will take a lot of time to bring about the change in thinking. And I'll add to that is, we only have about 2-3 decades to do these things. So it's quite urgent, and it's not only about investors, as Matthew asked, it's about changing mindset in society. I always go back to my own family. You talk about degrowth and they sort of, no, this is not in their frame of mind. So I think we have quite a task at hand to get society in general to understand, as you said before, this is not us going back to our grandparents in the 50s and 60s and living that way of life. But yeah, we have a challenge in conveying that message.
Mm. I mean, I think that pension funds are actually an interesting provocation point, because I think pension funds are, they have sort of a 70-year mandate, for instance, to create growth in their investment fund. But the purpose of that is to secure a future for the population that they represent. And if that future is, 3 degrees plus of global warming because they've been investing in the wrong things, well, that's not fulfilling their mandate in its true purpose. So those mandates perhaps need to shift. We need to have conversations between governments and pension funds about what the pension fund is for and what the best way to spend that money is. And these opportunities that we're talking about to completely change the direction of the economy by doing things, not just contracting the economy, but by doing things quite differently, those are the sorts of questions that I think pension funds should be talking about.
So as you said earlier on, it's a key issue for us to change the mindset of our business leaders and so on, because very often what we get asked by the younger engineers are, as you said in your presentation, there's a few questions we need to ask about what we're busy with. What's the product that we're developing, or the service, or the infrastructure that we're working on. But the feedback that I've had from a lot of young engineers is, we're young. We can't make these decisions. How do we actually influence our project manager, our operations manager, or whoever that person is up the line, to change, to think differently about these things?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem is, and I've seen this in engineering projects that I've been involved in my career, is by the time it gets to the engineer, a lot of the decision making has already been made. So, especially when it comes to infrastructure and those big money projects. So it is going back again to who's investing in those projects and what outcomes are they looking for. We're very used to talking about outcomes in New Zealand, big projects. But our outcomes are shifting because we want to have multiple benefits from our projects now. We want to have those well-being benefits with the greatest ecological efficiency. So we need to start bringing those new economy metrics into the earliest stage of decision-making about what we're going to do. Would we rather be investing in parks and bike lanes and tree-lined pedestrian ways, or do we need another transmission gully? Yeah, I think that's a new economy question, and the answer is really, really clear.
Yeah. So there's a question here from Nadine. MB developing a national circular economy or bioeconomy strategy. What advice would you provide to them for this strategy to incorporate degrowth requirements that extend beyond material circularity to circulate investment to regenerate rather than grow the economy?
The circular economy is really important, but ultimately what it does is it slows down entropy of man-made entropy. It's a technological answer. It's to do with efficiency of materials, but it also supports growth. And so if you look at parts of the circular economy sort of ethos that are about saying no, reducing, refusing, the refurbishing, the repair, those are the parts of circular economy that are important to degrowth. Those parts that fit into the convivial, the matrix of convivial technologies that I showed you before. So really that convivial technology assessment tool, that's really foundational, I think, for the shift. That research that was done, that answers a lot of questions about whether your circular economy projects are actually convivial.
Yeah. So it's basically first, let's reduce consumption, and then we think about how efficient we are with materials.
Yeah, and reusing old materials, old buildings, old machinery, and how can that be reused rather than just scrapping it and building something new? I mean, I'm not an engineer. I don't know the answers to these questions, but this is what transition engineering is about. This is what new architecture is about as well.
Yeah. So a question here from Anonymous, and it starts with the exclamation mark here. Yeah, just trying to get their head around all of this and wondering where and how to start. I work in designing for sustainable transport, i.e. active modes. So I'm involved in some ways, but it's also a business as usual context. What suggestions do you have for some initial practical steps to move in this new direction?
Okay, well, that's bringing these ideas to the work conversations, putting them on the agenda. Every meeting you're at, just have an agenda item, which is, how can we shift this towards conviviality? Getting that onto the agenda in the first place is going to be difficult, depending on who your boss is and who's running these meetings. But if you can get it there and you can start saying, how is this, relatedness? How is this accessibility? How is this adaptability? And those other aspects of convivial technology, and just keep bringing that question in. And then perhaps if you're working in a sort of consulting environment, going to your clients and saying, we're seeing this happening in the world around us. What do you think about it? Do you want to bring this into some of your questions and some of your projects? And maybe perhaps even talking to the more senior people in your organization about developing some kind of a position on, they don't have to call it degrowth, they could call it a socio-ecological future, they could call it a convivial future, they could call it a post-growth future. They don't have to use provocative words, but to have some sort of a stance as an organization about where they want to head on this. And, you know, baby steps, obviously, but maybe start ruling out working with some organizations who really don't want to give up economic growth, you know, going at, you know, really hard at it. Maybe don't work with them. Maybe start working more with clients who are have shared values in this space with you.
You know, just my 2 cents worth on that as well is, I think, as Anonymous says, they're working on active mode of transport, but very often in the engineering world, we tend to focus on a specific project. So this is all about, we're going to build cycleways in Wellington, but we don't have a systems-wide perspective to say, how is this fundamentally going to change the behaviors of people? And so this is why what we're seeing in Wellington at the moment is a bit of a kickback against these active modes of transport, because we're not really thinking about what are the needs of people and how to, so we need to think broader than just the boundaries of the specific project that we're working on, and see how that fits in with the wider system. That's my perspective, but it's easier said than done. Another Anonymous here, the change has to begin at the shareholders and board level before the businesses and enterprise can take the degrowth message or that of doing things differently. So how do you win the hearts and minds of shareholders and directors?
I think directors and, well, if I could say executives and directors as well, I think there's probably a layer of fear in terms of this, because obviously their jobs depend on them performing against the performance metrics of the old economy, and to say take a step into a different economic path leaves them vulnerable in their jobs. So I think they need to feel confident that there is a support for them coming from bottom up. So I think you know, strategists talking about degrowth talk about multi-scalar strategies, and that includes, you know, symbiotic change as well, which is people changing the system from within, as well as activists who are you know, demonstrating and lobbying about change from the outside, and then people who live an alternative life, who show how things can be done. Not everybody wants to live that alternative life. What we're trying to do is bring those ideas and bring them into the mainstream so that they are more widely adoptable. So I think that sort of multi-scalar and multi-agency sort of change, that it will all come together and bring confidence to those who make decisions that it's supportable. And this applies to politicians as well, because their careers depend on them making choices that are popular. And, you know, I hate to say it, we don't live in that era where the politicians say, this is what I think we should be doing and I want you to follow me. It's more, what does everybody think and what should I say? So having that groundswell, I think, will give all of those decision makers greater confidence. So it is really up to everyone.
Yeah, the message has to come from the bottom. And I think we are starting to see that with the new generation. You know, they just have a different perspective of what is important. And I think that's going to be driving a lot of decisions in the boardroom, but also down in the beehive, etc., I guess, going forward. Cheryl asks an important question here, because we won't be able to do this as Aotearoa New Zealand alone. So what's the shift towards this donut model within the wider global economy? How do we get countries to work together on this?
Well, luckily, there's quite a few countries that are probably already on board with this in some way. Politicians in various countries, there are quite strong political parties looking at degrowth and post-growth. Spain, for instance, has got a political party devoted to degrowth. There are politicians in Greece who are looking at it. It's very strong. It's very popular in the Netherlands. It's very popular in England. And of course, outside that sort of Northern European worldview, we've got all sorts of post-development ideas in, say, Latin America and in the continent of Africa. And so, there's what we call the pluriverse of alternatives to the Western economy, of which degrowth is only one idea. And it fits into that pluriverse, which is, anti-capitalist, decolonial, anti-patriarchal. And so, there is a sort of a brotherhood around the world of people who are prepared to keep pushing this in the workplace and in politics.
Yeah. And Fools sort of says it feels like a bit of an uphill battle, because if you think about what's, as you said, our financial capitalist economy and so on, we have marketing that promotes discontent, is what Fool mentions here. So, I mean, is this just society learning to be content with less? Is the question he asks.
Well, yes, content with purchasing less, but also finding ways to satisfy the things you need just through different services. Like, for example, your car sits idle 80% of the time. So you think you need a car, but you can still have a car if you use a car sharing service. What we need are those car sharing services to be very convenient for us, so that we don't need to have 100 people owning a car each. We can have, 100 people sharing 6 or 7 cars between them. So it's not about having less, it's about getting what you need in different ways.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier on, and just having that systems perspective. As you say, well, some people want to have a car because for whatever reason, but very often it's, I just want to get from a point A to B.
Yeah.
And do I need to have my own car? That's a good question. Sort of linked to this whole consumption and reducing consumption, and this always comes up. We had a debate downtown, or spotlight lecture series rather, a couple of weeks back, and somebody out of the audience always asks us when we talk about degrowth, is the population just too high, and is that not something we need to target? Because also linked to that, if you look at countries where populations are either decreasing quite significantly or reaching this cliff, as they talk about it, then the economists are very quick to point out, well, this is the disaster for the country. So I don't know, what's your feeling around this population, and is population really the big issue for us?
I think from an ecological economics point of view, there's absolutely no doubt that the lower a population is, the easier it is to satisfy well-being within ecological boundaries. I think in an ethical or in a moral way, it's a very difficult question to talk about decreasing the global population. I think it is global, the rate of growth is slowing. We're currently at 8 billion and we're projecting to reach about 10 billion by 2100. The scenarios that I've seen show that we can actually provide well-being for a global population of 10 billion people. So I'm very confident that we don't need to talk about population reduction. And I also think it's, it's very morally very shaky ground to be talking about that from a global north position, whenever we're the people who are affluent and using 27 tons of materials per capita per year. Yeah,
and I think that ties in very, very nicely with Matthew's question, because as you said, we can satisfy the well-being of 10 billion people if we do things better and reduce, as you say, in the affluent countries. But he is asking the question of how do we apply this thinking in developing countries? Because in countries like ourselves, we seem better placed for this degrowth, given that we already have all the infrastructure, not all, but some of the infrastructure in place. But developing countries still need to, and we talk about leapfrogging, developing countries don't have to go through the same path as we have, but we need to do that in a just way. So yeah, just the whole, and I know, I mean, I come from Africa, they're very resistant to having this first world speak and saying, well, you guys need to slow down, you can do things differently, you don't have to follow our path. So I think that's going to be one of our key challenges as well going forward.
Well, I mean, I think people who work in degrowth are at pains to point out that it's not, blanket degrowth all around the world. It's an accumulative degrowth. So some places the affluent nations will have to grow quite significantly. As I talked about, 75% reduction in materials use, 95% reduction in energy use. And part of the reason for those massive reductions is because other parts of the world need to grow. They're not delivering well-being for their people. They need more technology, they need more infrastructure, they need more investment. So we were talking before about opportunities. That's where opportunities lie. Still, there is still going to be growth economy for a number of decades, maybe the rest of the century, to get those developing nations achieving well-being for their people. And part of the problem as well is that, nations like New Zealand, we talk about offsetting our carbon emissions by buying overseas offsets. Well, that's a crazy idea because countries overseas, they need to use their land for their own purposes and their own people. So we need to stop relying upon offshoring our problems.
Yeah. And as I said before, we're all in the process of heading to the polls, or have done so already, but some of us haven't yet. So, I mean, it's a question from Anonymous. So do you hear any of our political parties or politicians sort of discussing along these or talking along these lines?
I have heard the Greens talking about it. I haven't heard really the other parties talking about it, no.
Yeah. Duncan, he has discussion of degrowth as a business risk being effective in your experience. To a certain extent, degrowth is already happening around us, and we will be increasingly exposed to international system disruptions, supply chain issues, technical strains, price shocks, etc. It seems like framing as risk may be useful for speaking the language of business while also communicating these controversial topics.
I could not agree more with what Duncan just said. And in fact, when I do speak to people in corporate environments, that's one of the suggestions that I have, is they start bringing a degrowth scenario or a post-growth scenario into their climate action. Companies have to, or larger entities anyway, have to produce a TCFD statement, Task Force and Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. They're also, in the near future, going to have to be producing a similar statement for nature-related disclosures. And so those sort of integrated assessment model scenarios, a post-growth one that takes into account shifts in well-being, shifts in stresses on nature, massive reductions in carbon emissions, and the risks and opportunities for business. That's a really important future for businesses to start contemplating.
Yeah, I think that ties in a little bit to what we said earlier on is businesses, I mean, as you say, I mean, as we all know, they go through this sort of strategic analysis or review, whatever you want to call it, and then they're sort of getting the message out of the market. And so they think about what are the sunset products, so what do we need to disinvest in? What are the new opportunities coming our way? So in some ways, I do think it's happening, but I agree. Framing that in terms of risk is certainly the language that they will understand.
I just wanted to quickly interrupt there and say as well that we just going back to your point, Alan, about a lot of our members are got a lot of young engineers, and it's like, how do we make a difference? How do we have an impact on what's happening at the senior management level and board? I think it's great when people are engaging in discussions like this and learning about what you were saying about integrated assessment models and all the regulation that's coming through from government, that this is something that businesses are having to consider. And so you don't want this to be around cost, but if you're winning or losing bids because you're not considering all of these things, that will be something that if boards haven't considered it before or senior management isn't considering it before, will start considering if they realize that it's going to have an impact on what they are going to win or lose. And again, I don't want it at all to be an economic thing, but I think that is something that everyone needs to consider.
Absolutely.
A question here from Anonymous, because I've seen some of the graphs around degrowth. well, maybe then let me not preempt it. What Anonymous is saying is that we have the tech and we have the infrastructure to deal with climate change, or that's well established, but the dichotomy is that this will require an increased investment in certain construction activities that may well have significant adverse impact on factors contributing to climate change. How can this be managed to ensure that we don't cause acceleration towards the tipping point, and how does the principle of degrowth fit into that in the short term?
Again, I would point back to the matrix of convivial technologies and use that as an assessment guide. I mean, that covers production, it covers extraction, it covers infrastructure, it covers use of products as well. So that is a guiding document for understanding whether you're heading in the right direction with your decision making.
Yeah. And so the question here is there a risk that degrowth would lead to recession within the economies, or worse still, depression?
Yes, there is a risk. But then there's a risk of that with climate change as well. So, climate change is coming at us. Energy decline is coming at us. We're going to be heading down. It's just a matter of whether we plan how we head down and try and do it prosperously, or whether we just take it as it comes, in which case the future doesn't look very good for a lot of people, because it may be very inequitable. So I think that the answer to that is we need to plan a prosperous way down, and there will be a lot of conflict, and it will take multiple decades. And yes, of course, there is risk of recession and possibly depression. I can't possibly say that there wouldn't be, but I don't think that the counterfactual looks very good either.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that then leads to the question from Kristen is, and maybe that's leaning towards the more practical issues. So they're asking, how can we transition from existing infrastructure, especially cities that's designed around cars and urban sprawl, to more ecologically balanced communities, and doing it fast enough to make a significant difference by the mid-century?
We're still going to need major infrastructure to move things around. We're still going to need logistics. What we do need is to have that alternative infrastructure as well that enables us to live differently, public transport, for instance. But we're still going to need to move things around. What I'd say as we get into smaller and smaller roads and into neighborhoods, we need to perhaps be taking some of the roads out. People won't need cars in their neighborhood. The car sharing service will be in the vicinity of where they live. So we can actually start having more pedestrian ways, more trees in our local neighborhoods. So I think the shift starts from neighborhoods and works out.
Yeah. I mean, we all think back to the lockdown COVID days. It was just fantastic walking down the street, and there's not a car that you have to worry about, right? Yeah. So, and we've seen clear examples of this elsewhere in the world. Utrecht because back in the 50s, they actually closed down some of the canals to build through a motorway. Then in 2000, they had a referendum, and they said, no, we're bringing back the canals, we're breaking down the motorway. The center of the city is not a place to drive through, it's a place to live. And yeah, and today, and it's a fantastic example. And there's other places, I can't remember one city in Spain, where they've had a mayor there for, must have been 4 political cycles now. He just banned cars. And originally there was a bit of a resistance to it, but now it's a fantastic city to live in, and people are happy. So.
Yeah.
That is fantastic. I'm just looking at the time, and now we're coming to an end. But I just want to firstly thank you, Jennifer, for taking the time to present on degrowth, which is a very different but I think, critical way of thinking. And to thank you, Alan, for hosting, and as always, when we've got two fantastic people who know so much about this subject matter, having such engaging conversations. And thirdly, to everybody who joined in having such animated discussions, but also, as we said, like what can people do? I think even taking steps like coming along, taking the time to listen to the thought process around this is an incredibly important step as well. So thank you both so much. You would have seen during just the end of this that we've had a survey pop up that it would be great. It would honestly take no more than 30 seconds to a minute to answer. We just want to know that we're on the right track and delivering information that you're interested in. As Alan's aware, we have got a practice notes that will be getting released in the next couple of months, and we're also developing a CPD module. So it's all sort of works together with the climate conversations, focusing more on how do we need to shift our thinking, how do we need to begin to start operating differently in our profession. So if you could take the time, that would be great. But I will now, hopefully everyone has a few minutes to grab something to eat, and just want to say thank you both very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, Bronnie.
Thank you both. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you later. Bye.